Is the Baltimore Ravens secondary officially back? We talk about that. The Ravens Week 5 win over Cincinnati, their Week 6 matchup with the Giants, and more coming up next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we've returned another episode here of Locked On Ravens. I'm your host, Kevin Allstriker of Ravens Wire. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for tuning in today, making us your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms. That also includes in video form over on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline, as we covered this season, with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts, and we are back. It is a Taco Tuesday episode, and in this Taco Tuesday episode, it's a jam-packed one here today. We have a ton to dive into, talking about the past, the present, and the future here for this Baltimore Ravens team. In the first segment, I do just want to dive back into the Cincinnati game. Again, Baltimore pulling off a massive win. They picked up a big victory on Sunday Night Football, 19-17, just getting into more takeaways that have formulated over the last 24, 36 hours. And guys who stood out to me, impressed, didn't, etc. In the second segment, though, I do want to talk a bit about this Ravens secondary, because I know there was a lot made of the unit early on in the season, going through injuries and whatnot. But I want to officially ask the question here and answer it. Is the Baltimore Ravens secondary officially back? So we'll talk about that in the second segment. Then in the final segment, we'll look ahead a little bit, talk about the Giants matchup in Week 6. We'll obviously preview that throughout the week here on Locked On Ravens. Also talk a bit about some potential trade targets, as the Carolina Panthers fired Matt Rule yesterday. And there could be some potential big pieces available and up for grabs. So we'll talk about who the Ravens could potentially target there also in the final segment. So let's dive into the content. Before we do that, though, if you want to support the show, support the channel, be sure to subscribe to us here on YouTube. Follow along in audio form as well. The same show, both audio and video, if you want daily Ravens content 5 days per week. So game analysis, updates, anything you can imagine Baltimore Ravens, we have it here for you. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter at ChaosStriker34 and the Locked On Ravens account at Locked On Ravens. But let's now talk about that Week 5 win against Cincinnati. Again, 19-17. We recapped it in full on yesterday's show. So if you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend you do so. But this was a game that I think, again, it wasn't necessarily like this must-win game in the fact that they were going to be eliminated from the playoffs if they didn't win it. But after coming off such I'll call it a devastating loss in Week 4 against Buffalo, even though they kind of did it to themselves, right? Blowing the lead, the offense not scoring, etc. And credit to Buffalo too, right? You can't not give credit there. The Ravens definitely, I think, had to win this matchup, especially because of the opponent also. It's a divisional matchup, a team that blew you out twice in 2021 in – honestly, they were probably embarrassed by both of those blowouts. So to come out there and have the game that they did, and look, it definitely wasn't a perfect outing, right? I am all for giving fair criticism where it's due. I'm also all for giving fair praise when it's due. And I know one of the more, I guess, controversial topics of the game was Lamar Jackson. Look, Lamar Jackson did not have his best game on Sunday night. It's true. He had the overthrows, missed a couple other throws, looked a little shaky. But I do want to give Lamar Jackson credit. I do want to give him credit, especially on the final drive. All that matters really is wins and losses when you're coming down to the actual final outcome of the game. You either win the game or you lose the game. You can win ugly, you can lose ugly, you can win pretty, you can lose pretty. Or maybe there's not a pretty loss because it's all losing. But regardless, Lamar Jackson, when it counted, when he needed to put his team in a field goal range, he needed to orchestrate a game-winning drive to put Justin Tucker in the position that he had to be in to kick that game-winning field goal. Lamar Jackson delivered. Again, a masterful 7-play, 50-yard drive in a minute 58 seconds that won the Ravens the football game. So huge shout out to Lamar Jackson there. But Colin Cowherd actually made a pretty good point that I wanted to bring up here. And it's interesting, I'd say, because when you talk about Lamar Jackson, now I've definitely talked about stuff like this before. Colin Cowherd pretty much said that Lamar Jackson is the only quarterback who is not allowed to lose or to win ugly, excuse me. So I think he's right. I actually think Colin Cowherd is right in the situation, in the fact that Lamar Jackson is the only quarterback not allowed to win ugly. And I'm not saying that, Lamar Jackson, every single thing he does is criticized, but kind of feels that way. Like it definitely feels that way. We have seen countless criticism of Lamar Jackson. And look, again, some of it is warranted. Lamar Jackson is not a perfect player, much like no one in the NFL is a perfect player. But I feel like Lamar Jackson's successes can sometimes be a bit pushed to the side, his mistakes magnified a little bit. So when you're talking about a win like this, where look, again, Lamar Jackson didn't play particularly well in this game. It wasn't his best performance ever, but we're still starting to see a little less of this, I think, actually, where people will say, well, he can't play quarterback, and it's still there. Don't get me wrong. And it's unfortunate because he's a phenomenal passer and also a phenomenal runner. That's what makes him Lamar Jackson. But I agree. I think that when you're talking about a player who is as dynamic as Lamar Jackson, as electrifying as Lamar Jackson, he is changing the game. Each and every week he steps out on the field. I love watching it. But people just have to respect what he's doing. And again, he will have bad games. I would classify week 5 against Cincinnati as not a great game for him. Same thing week 4 against Buffalo. But, he's still, I think, in the bottom of that MVP conversation. And again, he won the game. He delivered the Ravens a win at the end of the day. So while he had the overthrows, had a couple mistakes, etc., the interception as well, he did what he needed to do in crunch time. So I give him credit for that. And I wish that people would let him win ugly a little bit sometimes, right? Where you can still criticize him for the mistakes, but also you can say, hey, look, you know what? He won the game, and that's a big part of everything that goes on. Right? You got to win games in order to make the playoffs and the Super Bowl, etc. So there's that aspect. Other people who I was impressed with, and we kind of did glance over on Monday's show. Offensively, I think Mark Andrews played really well. It's just doing Mark Andrews things. I know Travis Kelce's the big bright story, having 4 touchdowns on Monday Night Football yesterday, but you know what? Mark Andrews is still playing out of his mind right now, and he is absolutely. I still think he's playing like the best tight end in football right now. I know, again, Travis Kelce's the shiny thing right now, but I think Andrews has had that consistent success over the course of the season. So there's a hot take. I don't think it's that hot of a take, but there it is if you want it. Also, I think Devin Duvernay, again, stepped up to the plate when he needed to when Rashad Bateman is out with this injury, his foot injury. Who knows how long he's going to be out for, but he definitely did step up to the plate. I think Ronnie Stanley, a big shout out, big credit to Ronnie Stanley coming back, his first action over 350 days, second game in over 700 days. And he, again, is on the pitch count, but when he's in there, he looks spry. Running pass game looked good when he was out there. I thought he looked good overall. So big shout out. Congratulations. Also, friend of the show, Ronnie Stanley, who was on here with me about a year ago now, a little less than I think a year ago. So big shout out to him. Defensively, man, there are a lot of guys I can shout out, and we'll talk about some of them in the second segment. Jason Pierre-Paul getting his hands on a couple of batted balls there where it was actually back-to-back plays. And I think that's been a huge emphasis. We had heard and seen throughout the course of the offseason, Baltimore practicing that, preseason games we saw it. Even in the regular season so far, we have seen it. The Ravens have emphasized getting their hands on the football at the line, batting the balls down, and that helps you as a defense putting the Bengals or whoever it is in the second and long, third and long situations instead of maybe a completion that goes for 4 or 5 yards and you're putting a second and medium. Second and long is always better than second and medium. So shout out to Jason Pierre-Paul. Had the sack also, so big credit to him. Patrick Queen. Shout out to Patrick Queen for the interception that he had on Joe Burrow. He had those 2 honestly somewhat costly drops for the Ravens in the past 2 weeks before Cincinnati. He was not letting that third one out of his hands. He practiced all week, and I want to give credit to him for being able to bounce back and have that interception where, again, it was tough to see him drop those couple, but he did do what he needed to do in the third instance. So third time's a charm for Patrick Queen. And then segueing into our second segment, Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters and Pepe Williams in this secondary is playing out of their minds right now. They're incredible. Corners, safeties, we'll talk about it. But Marcus Peters was the energy, the life force of this defense. He has come in, and with each game, he is getting, more back on track and back on track and back on track with the ability to come in after an ACL injury that cost him the entire 2021 season. And he's balling. He is balling out. He is tackling. He is doing a lot of different things. And in this game, he had the stick on a play. He also had another stick on Joe Mixon. No, it was Tyler Boyd on the play where they were trying to throw the ball in the end zone with Tyler Boyd. And Marcus Peters said, not in my house. He did the Kevin Mutombo finger wag. He said, nope, not today. And then he's, celebrating, and he is such a difference maker. And we'll talk about it in the second segment. But my final point will be Baltimore picked up a huge win here. It kind of goes full circle. The Ravens, again, went 1-5 in their division in 2021. And to be able to do this, to be able to make Joe Burrow look so ineffective and uncomfortable throughout the entire game, and a game that many people thought was going to be an offensive shootout, myself included. I know some people didn't, but with so many questions surrounding the defense, with the questions surrounding the run game, I thought the running game looked good too. So shout out to J.K. Dobbins and Devin Duvernay, who played a role in that. Lamar Jackson, obviously, too. The Ravens are starting to, I think, find their balance, and it's really important overall moving forward for them to continue to do that. But coming up in the second segment, we are going to be diving in to the Ravens secondary, and if they are officially back, if we can officially put that title on them. So be sure to stay tuned. We still have a ton to talk about here on the show. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about Tommy John. And to be ready for anything, you need underwear that can handle everything. It's time for Tommy John underwear. In Tommy John underwear, you're that much more comfortable, so you can do everything better. And if you name a problem with other underwear, Tommy John's has solved it. Tommy John's breathable, lightweight fabric has 4 times the stretch competing brands. And also, thanks to a non-rolling waistband and legs that never ride up, they feature a horizontal quick draw fly as well. And with over 17 million pairs sold, people love Tommy John underwear. That's why Tommy John doesn't have customers. They have fanatics, and so many people love Tommy John because of all the amazing things that they offer. And everything is backed with Tommy John's best pair you'll ever wear, or it's free guarantee. So go to TommyJohn.com/lockedon right now for 20% off your first order. 20% off your first order at TommyJohn.com/lockedon. TommyJohn.com/lockedon. See site for details. We're back here, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still hanging out with you here. Again, thank you so much for tuning in today, making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow along in audio form, the whole shebang. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for everybody who's already done that. But let's talk about the secondary now. Secondary, in my opinion, huge asset for the Ravens to be able to have so much talent in that unit. I mean, corners, safeties, it's huge. And especially because of the way the league has gone, right? Everybody is doing the whole passing thing where all you stack up on receivers, you put 3 out there, you have a tight end who's a pass catcher. Got to have corners who can cover, got to have safeties who can match up. It's important. And I think Baltimore, with the way they've invested, and this is not just a this year thing, they've invested in their secondary for a long time, draft capital wise, contract wise. Like they have poured countless amount of millions. They have poured a countless amount of draft capital into there. You could probably count it up if you wanted to. I can't do that right now off the top of my head, but they have. And I mean, if you're talking recently, Marlon Humphrey, almost $100 million deal. Marcus Williams, $70 million. Marcus Peters, they signed to a big extension. Kyle Hamilton, first round draft pick. You want to go back a little bit. You have Jimmy Smith, first round draft pick. Guys who are really important to the framework of this defense. And so when you're talking about my question, which is the Baltimore Ravens secondary back? I mean, I think they are. In my basis, there are a couple things, but I want to start with the fact that over the past 2 weeks, you have the Buffalo Bills and the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, the Bills game was a loss. That's not lost on me, but the Ravens held Josh Allen to 213 passing yards in that game. The Bengals, week 5, Joe Burrow, rattled, unsettled, etc. The Ravens secondary held him to 217 yards passing. That's 430 yards combined between what many people think are 2 of the best quarterbacks in the NFL right now in that conversation, absolutely. So big shout out to the secondary. And I think talking about what happened to them in week 2, where Tua Tagovailoa throws for 469 passing yards. That's more than they gave up combined to Burrow and Allen. That's incredible. And I think it speaks to the turnaround of the defense, but there are always the early season overreactions by everyone. In one way or the other, everybody has the early season overreactions. And I know part of it was, where's this defense? Are they going to show up? Are the big plays going to stop? And I had talked about, I keyed in on some of the things they had to improve. Big plays were absolutely honestly, I think it was my biggest point, which was they have to stop the big plays, keep everything in front of them. And I think the defense, if they can do that, will do the rest. Like the front 7, et cetera, they will be able to do the rest. And so far, over the past 2 weeks at least, they've been able to keep almost everything in front of them. No super, super big plays. It's not like in week 2 or in week 3 against the Patriots where Devontae Parker had like a god game where he was just unstoppable and had like over 30 yards per reception. You didn't have that in week 4. You didn't have that in week 5. And that I think is super impressive. And it speaks, I think, to the volume of just getting everybody settled in. It's early season, week 1, week 2, week 3. You have a new defensive coordinator and Mike McDonald trying to figure things out. The Ravens also went through some early season injuries there too. I mean, you lose Kyle Fuller in week 1. If you're the Ravens, Marlon Humphrey goes down with a groin thing. He's kind of in and out in that week 2 game against the Dolphins. Brandon Stevens also gets injured a little bit. Marcus Peters, going into week 5 against Cincinnati, had a little issue where he was able to play, and I'm happy you did because of what ended up happening in the game where he was, again, the spark plug. But now you're beginning to see guys getting more comfortable. And the secondary was terrible last year. It was not good. They were a bottom 5, bottom 2, bottom 1 unit in a lot of different categories. And I think a lot of that did have to do with their injuries, not having Peters for the year, having Humphrey go down later in the year, having to deal with the loss of Deshaun Elliott midway through the season. You had the game against Cincinnati in week 16, and I highlighted this, where Joe Burrow throws for 525 through the air. In that game, you look at the Ravens' top 4 cornerbacks. It was Anthony Averett, Tavon Young, Darrell Worley, and Kevon Seymour. I know I touched on this yesterday, but it was those 4. In this game against the Bengals in week 5, the Ravens' top 4 corners, Marlon Humphrey, Marcus Peters, Brandon Stevens, Pepe Williams, Joe Burrow throws for 217. So, it wasn't all injuries last year for the Ravens, but they played a big part, right? Like, come on. Injuries played a huge part in that, I guess, demise of the team where they started off top seed in the AFC, and then the secondary, over the course of the year, it was missed tackles, miscommunications, but we're seeing the settling in aspect, I think, and it's really in full swing right now, where miscommunications with Kyle Hamilton happened in week 2. What happens in week 3? He settles in, he bounces back, and I think we've seen some consistent play there overall. Now, the loss of Marcus Williams is big. They're going to place him on IR. John Harbaugh announced on Monday, so that'll be at least 4 weeks, but it's not a season ender. And Williams has been a turnover machine. He's been that back-end presence that the team has needed. They've needed that back-end presence for a while now. And I think when you're talking about what the Ravens do turnover-wise, or at least what they have done turnover-wise this season, the Ravens in 2021 had 9 interceptions total throughout all 18 weeks. It was 9. Through 5 weeks, they have 8 right now. So they have the potential to tie or even overtake their interception total from all of last year in less than 6 weeks of the 2022 season. The emphasis on turnovers has been huge. I think the tackling from the secondary has been better this year. I mean, again, I talked about Marcus Peters and the tackling in the first segment. Peters isn't regarded as a tackler, but when he actually tries to tackle and he is committed to it, we saw him in the playoff game against Tennessee during the 2019-2020 season, that 14-2 year. He stuck Derrick Henry on the second or third play of the game, got the crowd all fired up. Now that's about all that happened in that game. But I think Peters in that Tennessee game was the MVP of the game, honestly. He was that, I say defensive MVP. He was that good in that game. He chased down Derrick Henry. Peters is a willing tackler when he's actually willing to do it. I know it's kind of duh, but when he's actually out there and he says, hey, I'm going to make this tackle, he can make the tackle. He's that swing factor. He's the X factor. I called Josh Bynes the savior of the defense last season. I'm going to call Marcus Peters the savior of the defense this season. Now, maybe that does go to a guy like Tyus Bowser later in the year, or maybe Jason Pierre-Paul continues his ascension. But I'll say right now, the difference is a settled in, fully back, fully confident, fully Marcus Peters. And that's big because, Marcus Peters is, I think, a unique personality. And I love Marcus Peters' personality. I think his personality is phenomenal, exceptional. He brings fire. He brings energy. He loves football. He is competitive. That's something this Ravens defense needs. Not that they don't have other guys like that, but he adds an element to this defense that I just don't think you can replicate. And we saw that last year where he is that big X factor to me. I think people feed off of him. His teammates feed off of him. Marlon Humphrey's playing confident. Kyle Hamilton, we talked about. Chuck Clark in there. They have Geno Stone. Pepe Williams, huge shout out to Pepe Williams. These are the Ravens secondaries that you want to see on the field. Now, that's the key, though, on the field. If this team has to go through injuries again, I know the big saying is, well, the Ravens start the year with 50 million corners. They end the year with 2. We almost got there in week 2 with how many injuries they went through. Luckily, we're back to, I think, semi-full health, at least, pretty good overall outside of the loss of Kyle Fuller and obviously Marcus Williams now for however long he is out. But I will throw some stats out in terms of what this team has done improvement-wise in the secondary. So I'll start week 3. At the end of week 3, Baltimore's pass defense was second to last. They were 31st in the league in net yards per attempt. After week 4, that number dropped, and they actually ended up moving up in the rankings to 23rd. And now at the end of week 5, that number has moved up again to 21st in terms of pass defense. So they are on the upward trend, and that's what you want to see, is the consistency of being able, I think, to just improve each and every week, and you continue to settle in, right? The first 4 weeks, there's going to be sloppy football. There's going to be this and that. You want to win the games. This team obviously, I think, should be 5-0 right now, or 4-1 or something like that. But 3-2 is not a bad spot to be in, especially if you're in first place in the AFC North. I think a big credit to this defense, and the turnaround has been the secondary. So I'm going to say it. I think Baltimore's secondary is officially back. We'll see how it responds without Marcus Williams. I think that's going to be a key test. But as of right now, they've done enough to tell me that they have guys who can hold down the fort. Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters being the 2 key ones. I think other contributors who are going to have to step up are guys like Brandon Stevens, Kyle Hamilton, Pepe Williams, Chuck Clark, etc., etc. But we still have a ton to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. Don't go anywhere yet. When we get back here, we're going to be diving into some potential trade targets for the Ravens. Also talking about that Week 6 matchup with the New York Giants. So be sure to stay tuned. We still do have a ton to talk about here on the show. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting up to the minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check out on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to BetOnline.net to use mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. We're back here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still hanging out with you here on this Taco Tuesday after the Ravens' victory Monday after picking up a win on Sunday night against Cincinnati 19-17. But you do have to move ahead. There's another week of football coming up, and that is against the New York Giants here. 4-1 football team. They've been on a tear this year. I think they're for real, but this is going to be a test for Baltimore in terms of what they're going to have to do. So we will get into that in a few minutes. But first, there are some trade targets, potential trade targets for Baltimore. The Panthers firing head coach Matt Rule yesterday. And there are some talented players over there in Carolina. It is definitely a train wreck over there, don't get me wrong. But there is the potential for a team to go out there, multiple teams, to go out there and acquire star players to potentially help their team make it to the playoffs, the Super Bowl, etc. And I think Baltimore is 100% one of those teams who could be potentially in the running. Now, some of the names that have been named as maybe guys who could be moved, depending, obviously some more likely than others. You look at guys like Christian McCaffrey, Brian Burns, DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, etc. There are other guys as well. I think if you're looking for the Ravens, I talked about wide receiver yesterday, and just where they are, I think they could definitely stand to add another player in that room, especially with what we are seeing right now with the Rashad Bateman injury, where he goes down, what happens? Like, if they're okay, I think, with Bateman and Duvernay and then kind of having everybody filter in behind them. But when Bateman goes down, you have Duvernay and then everybody else. And if Duvernay goes down, your number one is DeMarcus Robinson. I think that would be the one. So, yeah, I think that the Ravens definitely could use another guy there. Maybe Odell Beckham is a signing they could make, Will Fuller. But they have those two receivers over there in Carolina, DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. I say go out there and get DJ Moore. We'll talk about this throughout the rest of the week, too. This isn't the only time we'll be talking about DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson in this Panthers team who could be looking to sell off some pieces. But I think DJ Moore is that number one star. Obviously, a Maryland guy. You can bring him home to Maryland if you're the Ravens. He's a stud. I think he's a bit underrated, actually. You know, I think just the quarterback situation he's had in Carolina has not been wonderful over the course of his career. So Unfortunately, I don't think he's getting the respect he deserves. Now, a lot of people have asked the question salary-wise. Well, this season wouldn't be a total issue. Actually, so what happens in trades, just for a quick refresher and reminder, is the base salary is what comes over in the trade. So for DJ Moore, he has a $1 million base salary for 2022. It's easy to fit in. It's easy to fit into the Ravens books if you're Baltimore, but then it becomes what happens after that. Moore signed an extension with the Panthers. That cap hit moves up to $20 million. The base salary moves up to $20 million in 2023, $15 million in 2024, $14 million in 2025. So maybe there's some restructuring to be done there. We've talked about, getting Lamar Jackson, that number one star receiver who has kind of been an established option in the league for a while. I think DJ Moore fits that bill. I know he's maybe not as big of a name as DK Metcalf or Stephon Diggs or DeAndre Hopkins or Deebo Samuel or some of those guys, but I still think that he would make an impact for them. And so you'd probably have to part with some high draft capital to get him. And plus you have to pay the money and restructure whatever deal it would be most likely, or just pay him the base salary, the cap hit that you would have. But I think Moore would be a worthwhile investment, but it feels like the more realistic option might be Robbie Anderson. Anderson is a guy who a little bit less of a cap hit, a little bit. Now, the base salary for 2022 is actually pretty similar. Robbie Anderson actually has a $1 million base salary as well, so not too different there. But 2023 has a $8.8 million base salary, so you can still make it work if you're the Ravens, but it's less financial commitment, especially when considering what Lamar Jackson is going to command if you're the Ravens and what you're anticipating he's going to command. So my top choice would obviously be DJ Moore, but it just feels like maybe the more realistic option would be Robbie Anderson. Brian Burns, I think, would cost you a lot. Look, worth it, obviously, but again, I feel like a wide receiver right now, because you're getting Tyus Bowser back. You're hopefully getting David Ojabo back. Justin Houston's going to come back in the fold eventually here too. I think once those guys are all back, you are pretty set there at outside linebacker. Personally, I know this might be a little bit of a hot take, but with that in mind, with those guys coming back in mind, I think wide receiver right now is maybe where I would go, because terrible situation would be if Devin Duvernay goes down while Bateman is already out. And then obviously you still have Mark Andrews, and that's all okay. Like, right, that's great. But who else is in that room? So that's why I think for the Ravens wide receiver wise, you have an option to go out there and get DJ Moore. Maybe it's Robbie Anderson. Who knows? I think either of those guys would be worthwhile for the Ravens to go out there and get. But let us get back to the Giants. Week 6, as promised. It's going to be, I think, a tougher matchup than some people anticipate, but there are a couple keys, and we'll get into these keys throughout the remainder of the week here. So stay tuned for those episodes throughout the rest of the week. But this is the Saquon Barkley show for the Giants on offense. The Giants right now are the worst passing team in the league in terms of net yards per attempt. They are 32nd in the NFL right now. Daniel Jones, I think, has looked a lot better this year than he has in previous years, and I know there's not a very high bar there, but look, it's true. He has been able to lead them to wins, and I think that if you're the Ravens, you want to sell out, you want to stop this run game, but the issue is what happened against Cincinnati in Week 5 was the Bengals came in as the second worst rush offense in the league, and the Ravens gave up 4.8 yards per carry to them as a team. After coming into the game, Cincinnati was averaging 3.1. So the run game is a little bit of a concern for me on defense, especially with Saquon coming to town. But if you sell out and you stop the run and you make the Giants offense one-dimensional and beat you through the air, Giants are going through multiple injuries wide receiver-wise. Who knows how many of those guys will be back or not for this game. But I say, look, if Daniel Jones beats you, Daniel Jones beats you. But let's have it be that way as opposed to Saquon running all over you when you know Saquon's the best weapon on that offense. So that's where I am with that. On the defensive side of the ball, you might have heard of this guy, Don Martindale. Does it sound familiar? Does it ring a bell? Former Ravens defensive coordinator. He's going to be playing up against his former team. Definitely a revenge factor there for him. The Greg Roman versus Don Martindale chess match we all wanted. It is here, and it is coming. And I think for Don Martindale, we all know what he does. He blitzes. He lives by the blitz. He dies by the blitz. It helped Baltimore win games. It also burned Baltimore and was the result of them losing games. So we know Don Martindale is going to blitz against Lamar Jackson. The good thing for the Ravens is Lamar Jackson has been very effective against the blitz this year, much better. He's taken the short stuff, which is, I think, a blitz beater. Screen passes, I think we could see a couple of those, hopefully. I mean, I love when the Ravens run successful screens. We don't really see them a ton, but maybe we'll see one or two of those in this game. but you want to be able to have those blitz beaters dialed up, and you don't want to hold the ball for too long. We saw against the Packers, the Giants get multiple pass deflections at the line. Their safeties were doing it, but we know what Don Martindale does. It's the corner blitzes, the safety blitzes, putting everybody up at the line and confusing. Do you rush all 8? Do you put back everybody but 3? The Ravens know Don Martindale, but Don Martindale also knows the Ravens. So we'll be able to see it. It'll be kind of that chess match. It actually kind of like it will be. And I'm still confident the Ravens can pull this game out. We'll get into more formal predictions throughout the remainder of the week. But yeah, I think Baltimore is in a good spot here. Those are my keys. Also for the Giants offense, again, no big plays. Don't give up big plays to that Giants offense. For the Giants defense, if you're the Ravens going up against them, take a deep shot or two, get that pass offense established. But the Giants defense, so it's actually kind of interesting when looking at what the Giants have done on defense this year in terms of actual stats and rankings. Their run offense has not been good this year. They're giving up 5 yards per attempt on the ground, which is 27th in the league, but their pass defense actually is a top 10 unit. They're a top 10 pass defense, 5.9 yards per attempt given up through the air. That is 9th in the NFL. So I think for Baltimore, if they can establish that ground game, continue to work in J.K. Dobbins, Ronnie Stanley's pitch count hopefully increases this game, and then the rotation maybe won't be as much of a rotation, and you see Ronnie Stanley maybe in there for 2 series in a row instead of maybe just one and out. So Baltimore has a tough task ahead of them, but they're sitting in a good situation right now. That win, I think, hopefully they can continue to build momentum off of that. Much, much, much better going in this game with a win than a loss, obviously. But we'll continue talking about that throughout the remainder of the weekend, everything relating to this Baltimore Ravens team. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you again so much for tuning in. If you do want to support the show, be sure to subscribe, follow along in audio form as well. When we get back here tomorrow, we'll be talking more Ravens football here, of course, previewing that Ravens Week 6 matchup with the Giants and much more. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you right back here tomorrow.